So, just for those of you who weren't here last night, this was the conclusion of the session I offered where I looked at the beginning and the end of Luke's Gospel, which is going to be my focus today. And we looked at the image of the temple, which begins the Gospel, and the temple ends the Gospel. And I was suggesting that the temple is an ecological symbol. And I looked at some of the imagery of the images of temple, which would have been within the living memory of the Lucan community. I'm calling... I don't talk about the Lucan church. Churches don't exist until the 4th century. My favourite language is household, because that's how they would have known themselves, gathering in households. And I'm going to talk a little bit this morning about what I think is the social snapshot of the Lucan community, the Lucan household. I don't talk about Christians, because they don't exist really to the 4th century. I talk rather about Jesus' followers or Jesus' disciples. So discipleship is the primary expression and experience, and that experience continues right through to our present day. We are followers of Jesus. We are disciples of Jesus. So one of the things I was saying last night was, and this will be the theme that I'll be pursuing through today, is the Gospels, and my focus will be on Luke. The Gospels have been interpreted conventionally as materials or documents of faith reflecting on God's care for human beings. And Jesus is the one who comes to offer us that experience of God. So the interpretation of Gospels has been anthropocentrically driven. That's the point I was making last night. However, what I've been reflecting on is how to have an ecological sensitivity to the text. And once we begin to get green ears, so to speak, the texts start to resonate in different ways. And what I did some of that last night with the birth story of Jesus and the resurrection narrative of Jesus. And the two images that I focused on last night were the images of cloth, which surround Jesus' body at the beginning of the gospel and at the end of the gospel, and stone, into which he's laid at the beginning of the gospel and at the end of the gospel. And the imagery of clothing is part of the drama, the symbolic theme of the drama of the Passion of Jesus, particularly the luminous garments that Herod places around Jesus, which is retained on him right through to the resurrection and to the ascension. Okay, is that okay? Good. That's a nod. So today, what I want to do is look at the key imagery of listening, how to listen to Luke's Gospel. So the first thing I want to do is look at Luke's social landscape, and particularly some of the ways that the householders, the members of Luke's household, would have understood the earth. Then I want to offer a little overview of the gospel, a bit of which I did last night. Then I want to zero in on what I think are Luke's ecological principles, which emerge out of that story that Anne prayed with us over today. The story of Jesus' temptation. Because therein is contained what I think are the key ecological principles that run through the whole of Luke's Gospel. And then I want to move to what I've got here as Jesus' liberating proclamation. We know it off by heart. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Spirit has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, etc., right? Now, we're so used to hearing that as about Jesus' ministry to human beings. And I think it is. I think it is it's flagging the way that Jesus will be in Luke's gospel. But I want to expand it to suggest that it's actually not only about human beings, but it's about the whole of creation. So I want to look at that in this first session, which will finish in half an hour. And then there are some key themes that I want to look at very briefly. This, the word deed, the diabolos, which gets translated as the devil. What is the diabolos in Greek? The human body, and I'll be doing these very quickly actually, and I want to talk about the Galilean garden. Because the first part of Jesus' ministry, right up to chapter 9, is in Galilee, and Josephus describes Galilee as a garden. Josephus, the Jewish historian of the contemporaneous, really, to Jesus of Nazareth. And then I want to draw some concluding thoughts about that. I want to finish this around 11 o'clock, and then we'll have some conversation about this. So, does that sound okay? Are you awake? Yeah. Okay, great. So this is the Oh, by the way, I've got some handouts here. So these, if you happen not to be awake, as long as you don't dribble on these, these are the notes for the whole of the day. So if you'd like to take one and pass it on. And Susan did these off for us, so thank you, Susan. And as you can see from last night, I've expanded them so you can see them better. Last night was a bit of an eye chart for reading, but these are a bit larger. So as you can see, and I mentioned this last night as well, this is the conventional outline of Luke's Gospel. So it begins with the prologue, the first 4 verses, and then it moves into the introduction, Jesus' infancy and boyhood. Then we get his preparation for public ministry, which is where we get the story we had this morning in our worship. Then there's this ministry in Galilee, and then there's this journey to Jerusalem, which takes place around over 10 chapters, chapters 9 to 19. Almost half the gospel is given over to this journey of Jesus to Jerusalem. So it's a deliberate construct by Luke, where he includes where the evangelist includes material from the hypothetical source called Q. So when Luke and Matthew came to write their respective Gospels, they had something like 220 verses of wisdom sayings, which were common, and so the German scholars who discovered this decided in their theory they'd call it Q after the German word for Quelle, meaning source. So there's a common source between Luke and Matthew. And some of that dots this journey to Jerusalem. Then there's this ministry in Jerusalem, chapters 19 to 21, leading up to the kind of the high point of the gospel, chapters 22 to 24, which is the story of Jesus' death. And then 24 is the resurrection narrative. So that's the conventional shaping of it. What I see is another way of understanding this. And so after the prologue, there's this introduction with Jesus as Earth's child, and that was the theme I was exploring last night. Today I'm going to move in now into these ecological principles, and then work through into the ministry in the garden of God's earthly delights. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Yeah, I actually stole it from the Adelaide Festival, or Fringe, that's right. And then, so that's what we'll be doing a bit now. And then after our break, we'll be looking at the story of Earth's journey, dealing with earth matters, earth care, freedom, and I'm going to introduce in this first part this word ecotopia. And then, so we'll be working on that in the second session, and then in our finals, so that'll go from 19 to 21, the ecological interweaving of Jesus' word, and then in the final session, the suffering and death of Earth's child and the celebration of Earth's child. So what I've tried to do in these three brief sessions is to do a kind of a thumbnail ecological ride through the gospel, recognising that Luke's gospel is the primary gospel from Advent this year, right? So into next year, it's the gospel of Luke. So that's where I am. Just a word or two about the world in which we are. It's the Mediterranean world, and there are many theories where Luke's gospel is written. The popular one is this one here at Antioch, currently in southern Turkey. It was in the first century in Syria. I've visited Antioch several times, but because of the migration tensions between Syria and Turkey, I haven't been there for a while. The other theory is up here in Macedonia. So these would be the two candidates for where Luke's gospel is focused. I moved towards Antioch because it's the primary city, apart from Jerusalem, that gets focused on in Luke's second volume, the Acts of the Apostles. So, wherever it is, it's part of the Greek-Roman world, and it's part of the world in which that is connected to the various understandings of earth. Now, I think I've given you this, haven't I? So this is a social snapshot of an ancient city complex in terms of the people. So this I didn't invent this. I actually borrowed it from. There's a whole lot of work done by New Testament scholars on the social world of the Mediterranean from the first century. So one scholar has come up with this design, this little looks like a flask. And what he has done is plotted against the number of people on the bottom base with the status in the higher base. So right at the top is, of course, the regal embodiment. So the king, and then in terms of the Jewish world, the Herodians, the high priests, and the lay aristocrats. They would represent about 5% of the population. Then as you come down, you get these characters called the retainers. So these would be the tax farmers and bailiffs and so on. So these would be working on behalf of the elite. And the further you come down, then the major group are these rural peasants. And also you'd have urban merchants and artisans. So peasants would be the majority, about 75% of the ancient world. And then as you come down further, you have the unclean and the degraded, and then the expendables, those that weren't valued to be alive. What I've done is I've placed a dotted line around what I think is the social composition of the Lucan household. Now, I come to this dotted line as I read the gospel. I think it's a window into the social world. If I picked up an advertiser reporting of something that happened 10 years ago, I would be able to trace through that reporting, hopefully, what the world was like back 10 years ago. so that the text becomes a window. In fact, you've called the program Windows into the Text. It's a window into the world. And we can see all these characters emerging through the social world of Luke's Gospel. Now, when I try and plot this against a typical Greco-Roman world, a Greco-Roman city, because I want to say two things. First of all, Luke's Gospel is an urban gospel. It's for a city followers of Jesus. The second thing I want to say, that I've just forgotten what I wanted to say, it'll come back to me, but so it's an urban gospel. The second thing I want to say is the gospel is primarily intended for people who are wealthy. Now it's explicitly addressed to people of wealth. It doesn't mean it excludes people who aren't wealthy, but it is incorporating those who don't have the social status. But it's primarily addressed to people of wealth. So when Luke writes the Gospel, the very first 4 verses tell us what Luke is doing, and the Gospel is addressing it to Your Excellency Theophilus. So it's addressed to a person of high social status. And the reason that Luke does this is because what Luke wants to do through the Spirit of Jesus is to reconstruct ways that people get on with one another in the social world of negotiation. Because in this world, it was customary to stay with people of your own social status. So that creates division if you've got people of lower social status within the household. By household, I mean not just our conventional understanding, but it's the expansion of the slaves and soldiers who would have been part of the Lucan landscape. They are addressed by John the Baptist. So if I put this up, this is a kind of a construct of what an ancient city would look like. So it's in the centre is the temple or the palace, and then you have the market areas in these little squares here, and then you have on the outside of the walls other characters. So where you are in relation to the temple and the palace is indicated by indicates your social status. I mean, I think even in Adelaide we have that kind of feel, don't we? I lived for most of my life on Hanson Road in Woodville Gardens in a trust home. Okay, so that gives you an idea of my family's social status. And I had friends who lived in Sprott Avenue, just off Portrush Road. And when I walked into their house, it was a very different feel. You know what I mean? So this happens. So when I put up the kind of people that Luke's Gospel refers to and place them against this kind of world, I would imagine the household gathering somewhere on the fringes of the Roman city, a Greek Roman city, where it would gather in all these people who have their characters in Luke's Gospel. Is this making sense? Okay. So there are characters in Luke's Gospel who are elite, and Luke is addressing them because they are the ones that have got the power and the ability to reconstruct what a household of Jesus could look like in friendship. So it's the redesigning of friendship in this world.
Would they also be the literate ones more likely?
Yes, there would be some in the elite world who would be literate as we understand literacy, but often slaves of the elite were literates. Literacy in the ancient world, as I understand it, is very different from literacy in our world. Literacy, as we understand, of course, is the capacity to read and write. Literacy in the ancient world is the capacity to hear and remember and speak back. That's literacy. And the Gospels were constructed in such a way that someone could, of course, proclaim it, could read it and offer it to others, but in doing so, the rest of the members of the household would remember what was said and how it was said, and they would be able to repeat it back. Now, we have cultures that do that. In our technology, in our technological age, I think we are losing the capacity to remember. At least I know I am. I'm losing the capacity to remember. But the ancients, Luke's householders, would have heard the proclamation, and they would have heard it and remembered it. So within the ideal congregation, don't give people gospel or biblical texts to read during the worship. Okay? Now, I know in my Catholic communities, they do that. The best way to help to remove the very dynamic in which the Gospels and the biblical texts were formulated. Can you see what I'm saying? No? Yeah? Let me just repeat it. So what the text, the biblical text, and I'm thinking specifically of the Gospels, comes out of an oral culture. Oral culture, right? And so they're intended to be proclaimed in an oral dynamic. So what we've tended to do, I don't know what happens in the Uniting Church, I know in the Roman Catholic Church, in many parishes, they give people flyers with the readings on them. So does that happen in the Uniting Church?
We do it
Sometimes. Anyway. Okay. Whatever I'm up against.
What I do find, I absolutely agree with you, and it's a point I've
That's
made
problematic.
before we, working
Yeah.
worship leaders.
Yeah.
But it's about, one of the important things of the Reformation was being able to read the text for yourself.
Yeah. That's right.
And so I see that the
That's a good
devotion
point.
to having pew Bibles and texts available and so on is just for looking out.
Yeah. That's a
and we
good.
miss the drama.
Yeah. It's a good point.
I think, is there a distinction also between proclamation and storytelling? So we're actually, when we're speaking the gospel, we're telling a story.
Yeah. Well, I think when we're proclaiming the gospel, it is a proclamation, and we are telling the story. So it's both, as I understand it.
The Biblical Storytellers Network promotes that whole thing of standing and speaking
Yeah.
the word.
Yeah.
And I sort of dipped into that and found that was absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
Having come from a Baptist tradition,
Yeah.
everyone quoted the Bible
Yeah.
in church and
Yeah.
down looking at the text.
Yeah.
And somehow there's a different power when you actually speak, they say, from the heart and speak your text. And the first time I heard somebody do it, it was actually that story that was read this morning of Jesus' temptation. And I said to the person who said it, where did you get that drama dialogue from? And she went, that was just the text. And it was the way it was spoken.
Yeah.
And that does something different from
Yeah, that's right.
reading it.
And often I memorise the gospel for the day. It makes a difference when I step away from the lectern and people's eyes are following me and they're waiting for me to forget the next line. And of course, I deliberately pause and I can just feel they're with me, you know. It does make a difference because what it's doing is it's reinserting the gospel back into its original construct in the way it was brought together. The gospel was intended to be memorized in this oral culture, and one of the key and we'll come across this. You know, we can go on for hours like this, don't you? I mean, not unfortunately, but I do want.
Just looking at that, I went to the opening of Playford yesterday, and the lady did the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman.
Oh wow.
In this narrative style,
Mm.
and it was truly magnificent.
Yeah.
People were on the edge.
Yeah.
And she paused so well.
Yeah. I think it makes a difference. I mean, I celebrate a Eucharist Sunday morning at Lockley's at 8:30. First of all, I don't believe God's up before 9. That's the other thing. And the parishioners don't wake up until 10. That's the other problem. But now, what did I tell you that? Yeah, it's really trying to engage people with their lives and their world, but engaging them in a way that is authentic to the gospel. And the gospel is intended to be proclaimed like that. What I've got here is a kind of a map. I think I've got this on your sheet, have I? No, I don't. Is a map of the various social groups that would have been part of Luke's household. And each of these groups would have had different relationships to the earth, to the soil, to their environment. So so I've kind of gradated them, as it were. The rural peasants, of course, would have been dependent on the earth and its elements in order to provide grain, in order to provide a response to taxation, and so on. Then you get the urban peasants. The urban peasants are people who were people of the land, but because they could not provide the necessary amount of grain, they went into debt. Consequently, they went into debt with their kinship group. Finally, they had to sell either themselves into slavery, or they needed to go to the cities to look for work. And their properties were foreclosed, and maybe they went back later to work their properties as tenant farmers. Now, I think as I hear Luke's, and I'm talking about hearing the gospel, not reading the gospel. So I talk a lot about auditors or listeners to the gospel rather than readers of the gospel. So the urban peasants would have had this relationship to the soil, to the land, but now they've moved closer into the city. And so you've got the urban workers and then the elites who are far distant from the soil. So there's an ecological gradation between the peasants and the elites. Does that make sense? And I think this... So when I talk about Luke's gospel and the ecological resonances, it's plural, because there are a number of resonances that people would have who are being addressed by this gospel, depending on their social background, but they're coming together in a household with this variety of social groups, and the elites are tending to stay with one another and to use their power and prestige as control, and Luke's Jesus is getting them to rethink what all that might mean for them in the Greek-Roman world. Okay, so let's go then to what I think are the 3 ecological principles, and picking up the story in Luke's Gospel in chapter 4. So he returns. So this is the action of the Spirit, and the Spirit is it's not only the Spirit for human beings. The Spirit permeates the earth. That's a very strong biblical tradition. So he's led by the Spirit into the wilderness. So the wilderness is the place where everything is stripped bare and the possibility of life becomes expressed. The wilderness for the Israelites, for example, is the place of encountering God in a new way. So it's in this ecological setting that Jesus has this encounter with Satan. So the devil says to him, "If you are the Son of God, command this stone to become a loaf of bread." Okay, the stone is a product of earth. It's earth's gift. What is the devil actually asking Jesus to do to earth's gift as you hear it? Yeah, to dominate it and to abuse it. And Jesus says, it's written, one does not live by bread alone. So I think the first principle that comes through here is that earth is to be cared for by human beings and is not the subject of human greed. Hear that? Do you hear it? So, earth is to be cared for by human beings and is not the subject of greed. That's basically the temptation here. To make an earth gift to be manipulated to benefit in a way that is going to satisfy hunger. To make a loaf of bread. To manipulate it. So that's the first principle that I think emerges through the story. So what I'm doing is I'm attuning myself to the ecological resonances and seeing what this might be saying to us today. Then the second moment. The devil leads Jesus and shows him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And the devil said to him, "To you I will give their glory and all this authority. It's been given to me. If you then will worship me, it will all be yours." He answers, says Jesus, "It's written, worship the Lord your God and serve only God." And the second ecological principle is that communion with God deepens communion with the earth. So what the devil is trying to do is separate Jesus' connection from the earth. So the antidote to this is to be in communion with God. So solidarity through prayer with Jesus has ecological consequences. The way we are with God affects the way we are with other human beings and the way we are with creation. Okay? Then comes the third temptation. So the devil takes Jesus up to Jerusalem, places him on the pinnacle of the temple. The Greek word for pinnacle is P, it's a silent P, to gurion, which means wing. So on the parapet of the temple is this design of a wing, and of course the people steeped in Scripture would have heard, of course, of eagle's wings. You know, the loving care of God that comes out of the covenant relationship which God has with the people. So the wing becomes the symbol of this care. Well, it's right here that Luke's devil places Jesus. And he says, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here, for it is written, He will command His angels concerning you to protect you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against a stone." Jesus answered, "It is said, do not put the Lord your God to the test." So the third ecological principle, as I hear it, is that Earth's resources are for the good of all and not for manipulation or control over others. So this throwing oneself down and expecting God to respond is trying to manipulate in such a way that Earth's resources and Earth itself becomes manipulated. So those three principles I see work themselves out in the rest of the gospel. It establishes the way that human beings are invited to be with creation that becomes part of God's life. Let me just, I'm just conscious of our time, let me just finish with this little text here. Yes. Remember how I said the text is written in such a way that it's to be memorized. One of the classic ways that the ancients did this was it's what I call the onion approach, or the sandwich effect, or the technical word is chiasm. So if you want to say something very important, you put it right in the centre, and then you surround it with other elements. So it's like peeling back the onion layer to get to the core of it. It's what a good preacher usually does. Usually. What's that? It's a mnemonic, but it's thematic more than hearing, if you know what I mean. So, and I think this happens in this text where Jesus goes to the synagogue. They hand him the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and he reads from it. Now, what Luke does is bring together two texts from Isaiah, manipulates them, as it were, in order to make this the proclamatory statement of Jesus in the gospel. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because the Spirit has anointed me. So I hear the Spirit as God's creator spirit. So this is an earth action that's happening to Jesus. To preach good news to the poor, the Spirit has sent me, literally. So he, I don't know what gender the Spirit is, but translations have it, he has sent me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim the captives released, to the blind recovery of sight, to send the oppressed released, to proclaim the Lord's year of favour. So the A frame works together, the B frame is all about release, and the centre is about a recovery of sight, blind and the recovery of sight. Now, that's been conventionally understood as all about human beings. That's what Jesus has come to do. But actually, it not only includes human beings, but it also includes creation. Because creation needs to have the good news proclaimed to it. Creation also needs to be released because it's captive. Creation also needs to see what it's intended for. It needs to be released from oppression, and it needs to be an example of the Lord's year of favour. So, can you see, this is my last point really, because I do want to have some conversation. Can you see how once you start to take on this kind of earth stance in the interpretation, it's not excluding the focus on human beings, but it's inclusive of a much broader, wider understanding of this that includes creation. Now, what I'm going to do in the next session is to actually unfold this a bit further by looking at some stories where we see this happening much more tangibly. Okay?